Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar with Rachael Cristine Woody. My name is Bradley, and I will be your moderator for this webinar titled How to Perform Data Enhancement for Your Museum CMS. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Now, I would like to take a moment to introduce today's presenter, Rachael Cristine Woody. Rachael is the owner of Relicura and provides services to museums, libraries, and archives. She specializes in museum collections management systems, digitization technology, digital project management, and digital usership. During the course of her career, she has successfully launched multiple digital projects that include advanced digitization technology, collaborative portals, and the migration of collection information into collections management systems. She is also a popular guest author for Lucidea's Think Clearly blog and has provided us with many great webinars that are listed on our website. So please feel free to check those out after today's session. Take it away, Rachael.
Great. Thank you so much, Bradley, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Lucidea for hosting us today. And of course, thank you all for joining on a topic that I definitely enjoy and that we hope will be of great help and support to you. So with that said, let's get into it. Today, we're going to talk about data enhancement. And so we're going to start, first of all, working with a same definition as we get into the content. With data enhancement, of course, we will have different data fields that we are going to talk about, especially those that lend themselves to data enhancement work. As we think through these things and to help you consider which fields or which areas that you may want to enhance with your data, we'll have some prompts for you to consider to help guide and inform that process. Once you've decided and sort of scoped out at least the content and the areas that you wish to enhance, we'll have a conversation about common sources where we tend to find that additional information. Some of these may seem obvious and already top of mind for you, but a few others may be surprising. We'll then have a brief overview of prompts to help you create a plan. Because each area of data is different and because each museum and setup is different, there may be different areas that you are focused on, and that may impact the scope and how you go about the improvement and enhancement of those areas. So working through these questions will help each of you create your own individual plan. And then we'll talk about how to perform data enhancement. This will be a nice little overview on how one can do like data cleanup and transformation in general, which is a topic, of course, that we've covered in previous webinars, all related to the data cleanup process in general. So just an asterisk here, if you do want more information on how to perform data cleanup and transformation, then we definitely have additional resources for you. So to define data enhancement, in this case, we definitely use the definition of enhancement equals improvement. And for our work specifically, especially since we have best practices that indicate for us which fields, which information is required and which information is recommended, this allows for us a scale or a spectrum, if you will, of, okay, we've got the required, the basics we need in our museum collections management system. And yet there's so much more additional information that we could capture and provide that would make the experience for ourselves and our users better, improved, enhanced. And so these are areas where, yes, it may be recommended, but to help improve the user experience or improve our management of the collections, we may want to spend more time on doing those recommended things. Also, there are conditions that lead to enhancements. So depending on your museum and setup, while most of us are usually a little strapped for extra time and capacity, there are projects or grants or research or exhibits, basically periodic events that can happen, projects that occur that allow us to spend perhaps additional time and resources in areas where we can do that enhancement versus always just trying to do like, okay, basic requirements and moving on, basic requirements and moving on. So looking for those periods where we are allowed to sort of pause and spend some time improving and enhancing the area of our data. And then that question of if enhancement is optional, why do it? And of course, we do want to balance the many other responsibilities that you may have in your role. Many of us have at least a few different hats that we wear when we work in museums. And so I do want to encourage you, while enhancement is wonderful and it's an area that I always enjoy, it may not be something that makes sense for you all the time. And so just because it's something that you can do doesn't mean that it's something that you have to do. And so I encourage you to think about your data in general, your collection, and what areas make more sense, perhaps more than others, where enhancement may be an option for you. And when we get into the prompts section, that will help you sort of filter out in which cases or scenarios does it make sense to spend that time and capacity for enhancement, and in which areas perhaps is it not as worth it. Fields to consider for data enhancement. So there's sort of a common core of fields where it doesn't matter what sort of museum collection you have, they are typically the fields that are like the most ripe or the most available for data enhancement and improvement. For us, that's going to be any sort of like biographical or historical note. These can be required, but like bare minimum, so like maybe a couple sentences. However, there's so much richness to our collections and so much contextual information that could be very helpful in the interpretation and understanding of our items, that including more thorough and fuller biographies or historical notes, depending on the artist, maker, creator of the particular items, can be incredibly helpful for us as the collection stewards, as well as the users of our collection. Description, of course, the description field is one of those where it is required, but again, typically for us, when we're in like just basic requirements mode, it's maybe a couple sentences. Whereas if we do have the time to include more information, in this case, usually more contextual information to help describe the object, when it was created, how it was created, by who and why that matters, all of that additional information can help improve and enhance that record, and ultimately the understanding and interpretation of that item by anyone who accesses that record. Often this can lead to more improved inclusion of objects in exhibitions because there's just more of that information readily available. And it also helps to improve any of the curriculum or K through 12 education that may be based on your items. Having that more thorough description readily available can be a great aid to make sure that that object or objects are included in things that are appropriate in terms of exhibitions, projects, or curriculum. Provenance is one of those fields. It's not necessarily required, although in ethics and good practice, especially over recent years, capturing provenance and of course having that be transparently conveyed through our CMS is becoming more of an ethical requirement. And for us, it is definitely moving as part of that ethics movement from like bare minimum, we purchased it from here or we received it from this person, to what ultimately is the provenance history for that item, and what are the various changes of hands, times, who was involved, how was the object originally purchased or acquired in the first place. And so doing a much more deep dive and capturing of that deep dive in order to transparently provide it in our collections management system. So again, while it is more on the recommended side currently, I think we are steadily moving to where this is going to be adopted as best practice for the minimum requirements. Next field is related materials. This is an optional field, of course, but knowing that our items can have more meaning when they are related to other peer items, it can provide so much more meaning in terms of having that contextual relationship established. It can help with the planning of exhibitions, research, and curriculum. It can also help to unearth or highlight if there are archival materials or library books. also in your collection that happen to feature that item, or it's the archival records of how that item was excavated, or if how a painting was created. So having that ability to capture and relate it to peer items in your collection or even outside of your collection all can help provide more enhanced meaning for your items. Subject matters, subjects, believe it or not, are optional for most best practices, depending on which ones you adopted. So even if you already do have a couple subjects, I do recommend doing a review, especially as subjects, when we initially capture them, tend to be very broad as well, and seeing if you can provide some more pinpointed, more narrowed subject matter or classifications to help people discover your items. Part of that is through the access keywords like subjects, like places. And so being able to provide more detailed and pinpointed will help with accuracy, as well as just the ability for users, especially the general users, to sort of stumble in and discover those items for themselves. And then finally, places. This could be plural depending on object and object history in terms of where was the object created, where was it found, where was the object used. This also introduces a bit of cultural associations, at least for some historical cultures that used to be migratory, and how there can be places associated with those cultural communities depending on that historical time period. So places can actually be quite a bit of a deep dive to help track the history of that item, but perhaps also to help track the history of the cultural communities that were responsible for creating and using the items in your collection. So prompts to consider. So this is to help you think through where are there areas in our collection that we could enhance, and help you do that weighing and balancing of where does it make sense, where are we able and interested to do data enhancement, or where perhaps it doesn't make sense. And so it's good that we considered it, but we can move on. So first prompt, what data exists but could be meaningfully enhanced with further descriptive work? So this is the case where you may have, like, you've met basic requirements and you've got your minimal descriptions and a couple subjects, but having more information could lead to that object having more meaning and therefore being more used, more easily discoverable. And so where does that make sense? Where are there opportunities for that enhancement work? Next prompt, where are there opportunities to capitalize on in-depth research, a past exhibit, educational programming, events, etc.? And so this is that where there's an event or something that's happening in terms of there's a project, there's an exhibition, there's curriculum being created, there's something happening that has led to us being able to spend more time and more of our capacity doing a deeper dive and revealing, capturing, gathering this additional information on objects that we could then apply and make sure we have captured in our museum collections management system. Third prompt, which areas of the collection share affinities that can be leveraged to provide further contextual knowledge or to lend efficiency in further research? So these are areas of the collection where there could be this connection that maybe only we are aware of because we happen to be stewards of the whole, that may not otherwise be readily apparent. And where can we make sure that we are taking full advantage of that type of knowledge and being able to capture and apply that in our museum collections management system? And in our vetting of that, where are there areas of those affinities where, like, research could be furthered or inspired by having those connections captured? Common sources of information. So if you've made it through the prompts and there are various reasons why, or there's a circumstance that makes sense for you to do some data enhancement, and you've gone through and you figured out a few of the fields that you think you could focus on, next step is, where are there common sources of information? And so some of them are obvious first stops, taking a look and doing some research on what sort of articles may help to inform about the item, or maybe they are about that specific item in your collection. Encyclopedic references and scholarly work, especially if it is about the artist maker person who had created that item, the cultural community perhaps that had created and used the item, anything to help inform, if it's not about the item itself, about peer work or about the historical time period, all of that good contextual information that can help inform the meaning and interpretation of your item. Then, of course, perhaps not as obvious, but such a rich treasure trove is archival materials. For many museums, even if you don't have an official archive per se, if it's not quite its own department, there will usually always still be boxes and files of information that will, at a bare minimum, contain some of that provenance and accession information, and may even contain more in depth in terms of some papers from the original purchaser or person who acquired it, any other additional perhaps conservation work, or perhaps artist sketches, conceptual sketches of the artwork before they created it. So there can be so much great stuff, even if you don't have an official archives, that it's worth checking out to see what is available and that you could dig into and use for your enhancement. And then finally, the items in your collection, many of them have been on display at some point, and so can be a great first reference to check to make sure, okay, is there past research or curatorial interpretation work that was not captured originally in the museum collections management system that it makes sense to include now? And then we've got previous card catalogs or inventories. We, of course, didn't start out with our collections management system from day one. And so many past analog systems were in place for our museums. And while some of that, and in some cases, all of that information made it into the new digital CMS, that is not always the case. And so it's worth checking out the past paperwork in terms of the past catalog, the past inventories before your CMS to see if there was any additional information that may have not made it in to the electronic version of your collections management system. Accession paperwork, especially if that was not originally included as part of the archive research that you did, it may contain some more in-depth information other than just like the when and where and who in terms of the purchasing of, and then any other information that could inform your work. So these are great first stops, but depending on your institution, depending on your collection, there may be several other areas of information that you could tap into for part of your enhancement research and gathering. Now time to create a plan. So gone through prompts, identified fields, we even have thought about sources of information that we want to make sure that we use as part of our work. And so now we need like an overall plan here. So having a list and answering that, which informational resources will you gather? And depending on how many there are, I do recommend you do a little bit of a prioritization. When will you perform your research and synthesis of that information, especially if you're spending time with a few different areas of information? You'll want to allow yourself enough time to actually perform that research, as well as doing the synthesis of that information, the notes you've made, and ultimately the adjudication of what is included in that data enhancement in the CMS. And then how long will you need for the research and gathering phase of work? So depending on where you're going, what you're referencing, you'll need to get a sense of scale as well. For example, archives is perhaps one of the biggest variables of potential sources of information. It could be just one folder of information from the archives that is relevant for you. It could be 20 boxes of information that might be relevant for you. So having a sense of scale will inform how long it may take you, depending on the enhancement work you're doing. Next prompt, how will you capture the data destined for the CMS? And so this question is echoed in, of course, the past discussions we've had on data cleanup in general. If you have attended those webinars or read past works, you'll know that I'm a big fan of the spreadsheet, whether it's Excel or Google Sheets or what have you. capturing in each of the fields entries for your items and having that information ready to go in spreadsheet form. This can lend itself to import depending on what sort of collections management system you have. Sometimes you can just do a straight ingest of a spreadsheet. Even if you can't, though, a spreadsheet is a great electronic capturing of the data that you can then transform into whatever it needs to be ingested or transported into your CMS. Next, how many objects will you perform enhancement work on? So for each item you choose, while there may be some overlap in the research and enhancement work that you are doing, ultimately the number of objects will multiply the time you spend on the research gathering phase, as well as multiply the time you spend on creating that new data for that enhancement piece. So getting a sense of scale here in terms of how many objects you are going to include in this period of enhancement. How long will it take you to create the enhanced data? So this is going to be entirely variable on where the sources of information are, how much information you've taken from them, how many objects you have for that information, and how many fields or areas in the record do you intend to create that enhanced data for. All of those will impact ultimately how long it's going to take you to create enhanced data for the total of your object scope. And then how will you enter the enhanced data into the CMS? So this step is to have you look into, if you don't already know, how to get data into your collections management system, whether that is with a spreadsheet file, which is usually a CSV file, or if there's a different method that you'll need to use to get your enhanced data into your collections management system. So how to perform data enhancement. We talked about the spreadsheet, which is good to use just for your information gathering and creation in general, but can be used and imported into your CMS if your particular CMS tool allows for that. If not a spreadsheet, sometimes there's a way to sort of bulk capture using an import tool. If not through CSV files, sometimes it can be a JSON file or XML. So again, depending on your CMS, you may have a different from a CSV sort of import. Of course, working with your vendor, if you are with a CMS product that has a vendor in charge of the management and updating of its product and ultimately its support of you as a client, they sometimes have other methods available to them that would not otherwise be available to you as a user. So worth connecting with them, especially if you don't have that direct import access. There's the concept of like bulk creation or bulk edit. So depending on which fields that you are enhancing, how easy it is to isolate the records of the objects you're doing, what is the robustness and ability to add nuance to the sort of updates that you're doing through this bulk creation or update tool. You have the ability to play with it. So I recommend getting familiar, if you do have a tool like this, familiar with what sort of options it gives you. And then there's of course, the one at a time, which is not super exciting or appealing, but is of course always available to us, which is opening up one record at a time. And if you've put and created your information already in a spreadsheet, really just a copy paste of the data from that spreadsheet cell into the appropriate field that you are working on. So we covered quite a bit for data enhancement. We started with the common definition we were using for what data enhancement means to us. We reviewed the fields to consider for data enhancement. Some of those were enhancement on existing required fields, whereas others were an enhancement by including that field. We went through prompts to consider to help you think through where does it make sense to do data enhancement work in your collection. We then talked about common sources of information. Some of those are obvious that we usually check anyway throughout the course of us capturing object information, and others were perhaps not as familiar to you. We then took a look at the prompts to consider to help you create a plan for your data enhancement. And we did discuss the nuances depending on a few different variables. Your plan will look different just depending on your collection, the areas you're working on, as well as the different tools available to you ultimately for importing that new enhanced data. and then ultimately how to perform the data enhancement. We did a review of how you can get that information into your collections management system. And of course, if you would like more tips or support around that, you can check out the previous Lucidea webinars. And Lucidea, I think, clearly posts that we've talked about with data cleanup and management. So I encourage you to check those out if you want more support. Speaking of resources, Lucidea Press and I partnered on demystifying data preparation for a new CMS. And while the premise of this book is talking about getting your data prepared for a new collections management system, ultimately it will help you no matter what in terms of if you're staying with your current system, no need to do a new system, doing that data preparation, reviewing the data, doing data cleanup, etc., can be incredibly helpful. So you can check out your free e-copy, courtesy of Lucidea Press, by checking out that link. And with that, I will hand it back over to Bradley.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful presentation. And if you'd like to learn more about our museum collections management system called Argus, please feel free to visit our website or reach out to us at sales@lucidea.com, and we would be happy to have a chat with you. And if you have any more questions on any of our software or on our company, our contact details are listed on the screen. Please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to the series. On behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending today, and until next time, thank you.